It is December 1941. A young Filipino soldier crouches in a jungle foxhole somewhere on Luzon, gripping a rifle that his grandfather's generation had carried in the First World War. The steel is familiar, the bolt smooth from years of use, the 5-round magazine comfortingly simple. But out there in the darkness, moving through the undergrowth, advancing in waves, is a Japanese army that has just finished conquering half of Asia. And somewhere behind that soldier, in a marble and tile headquarters building that will soon be abandoned to the enemy, the general commanding all American and Filipino forces in the Pacific is signing a requisition order. 84,500 rifles, the newest, fastest-firing infantry weapon in the world, the rifle he had, in many ways, helped create. This is the story of the M1 Garand, and of the man whose decisions shaped it, wielded it, praised it from the foxholes, and ultimately could not receive enough of it in time to change the outcome of one of the most heartbreaking campaigns in American military history. If you're a student of military history, of the weapons that built and broke armies, of the men who understood that a soldier's rifle is his last line between life and death, subscribe to this channel, hit that bell. This story is one you will not hear anywhere else, told exactly as it happened. To understand why MacArthur was placing that order in December 1941, you have to go back nearly 20 years, to a quiet room in the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, where a Canadian-born machinist named John Cantius Garand was staring at a problem that had defeated every weapons designer in America. The year was 1919. The Great War had just ended. American infantrymen had fought it with the M1903 Springfield, a bolt-action rifle of elegant precision, accurate at distance, beloved by marksmen, the finest of its era. And yet the soldiers and officers who had actually used it in combat came back with a troubling observation. In the chaos of modern battle, where men fired and moved and fired again under constant pressure, the bolt action was killing them. A well-trained rifleman could squeeze off perhaps 15 aimed rounds per minute with a Springfield. A well-trained Japanese, German, or Russian soldier could do the same. The rifles had canceled each other out. Whoever could put more lead downrange faster with less mechanical interruption held the advantage. The Army knew this. Congress, as usual, did not want to pay for it. And so John Garand arrived at his workbench in Springfield with a task that seemed straightforward and proved to be anything but. Design a semi-automatic infantry rifle. Gas-operated. Reliable in the field. Chambered for standard military ammunition. Light enough that a soldier could carry it all day, and do it essentially with the budget of a mid-sized machine shop. Garand spent the next 15 years on this problem. He was not a dramatic figure, no medals, no rank, no speeches. He was a machinist who happened to be a genius, a man who, as a teenager, had designed a telescoping screwjack and patented it before most boys his age had held a paying job. He built prototype after prototype in the Springfield workshops, tested them, destroyed them, rebuilt them. He slept in the armory. He worked through weekends. He was not particularly interested in glory. He was interested in getting it right. By the late 1920s, the Army had narrowed its requirements for the new rifle. A critical decision had to be made. What caliber? Weapons designers and ordnance officers had become convinced that a lighter round, the .276 caliber cartridge, was the future. Less recoil, lighter ammunition loads, faster fire. Garand had built a highly competitive .276 design. In 1929, it won Army acceptance trials. It was, by most measures, the best semi-automatic rifle the competition had produced. The question of production seemed almost settled. It was at this moment that Douglas MacArthur walked into the room. MacArthur was Army Chief of Staff, the highest uniformed officer in the United States military. He was 50 years old, lean and imperious, a man who had been decorated for valor in the First World War and who had spent decades studying military history with the obsessive attention of a scholar. He looked at the .276 caliber proposal and he did not like it. Not because the rifle was inferior. He knew it was excellent. He objected because of a single word: logistics. The United States military had spent decades accumulating stockpiles of .30-06 Springfield ammunition, the same cartridge that fed the M1903 rifle, the Browning automatic rifle, and the Browning heavy machine guns that equipped American units around the world. Hundreds of millions of rounds. Warehouses of it. To adopt a new caliber meant discarding all of that, retooling every ammunition factory in the country, and training every soldier to handle a different cartridge. MacArthur personally disapproved any caliber change. He sent Garand back to his workshop with new orders. Make it fire the 30-06. This decision has been debated by historians and arms enthusiasts ever since. Some argue MacArthur was a bureaucratic conservative who slowed the rifle's development. Others argue he was the only man in the room who was thinking about how wars were actually won, not in proving grounds, but in the global logistical chains that kept armies fed with ammunition. The truth is probably both. MacArthur was difficult, sometimes arrogant, and often inflexible. He was also, on this particular question, correct. When the M1 Garand went to war in 1941, it fired the same cartridge as every Browning machine gun in every American unit in every theater of the war. Soldiers who ran low on rifle ammunition could pull rounds from machine gun crates. Resupply chains did not have to be split. Ammunition compatibility in a world war fought across 5 continents was not a small thing. Garand took the directive, adapted his design for the heavier cartridge, and kept working. It took another few years. On January 9, 1936, under MacArthur's formal authorization, the United States Army officially adopted the weapon that would be known to history as the M1 Garand. It was the first semi-automatic rifle in the world to be issued as the standard service weapon of any major military power. The United States was, in this one respect, a full generation ahead of every army it would eventually face. But adopting a rifle and fielding it are two different things. Production at Springfield Armory was slow in the early years. In 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and Europe's great powers tumbled into war, the United States had produced only a fraction of the M1s it needed. Most Army units were still carrying the old Springfield bolt action. The Marine Corps, historically resistant to any departure from its beloved M1903, had declined to adopt the Garand at all. The industrial machine had not yet caught up with the decision. MacArthur, watching all of this from his posting in the Philippines, where he had been advising the Philippine Commonwealth Army since 1936, understood the problem acutely. He had helped build the Garand. He knew what it could do. And he looked at the forces he commanded, a patchwork of American regulars, Philippine scouts, and newly mobilized Filipino reservists, and he saw a critical weakness. On July 26, 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt federalized the Philippine Army, bringing it under MacArthur's command as the newly designated U.S. Army forces in the Far East. MacArthur now commanded roughly 130,000 men on paper. In reality, many of his Filipino reserve divisions had been activated only weeks or months earlier. They were farmers, fishermen, and tradesmen handed rifles that in many cases predated the First World War. The 41st Division went into battle with M1917 Enfields. The 71st Division carried more Enfields. Multiple reserve regiments had equipment lists that read like a museum inventory. Weapons from 1917, 1914, even older. MacArthur's elite units, the Philippine Scouts, the American 31st Infantry, had received the new M1 Garands. But the mass of his army was armed as if the calendar read 1918. In the fall of 1941, MacArthur submitted his request: 84,500 M1 Garand rifles to replace the obsolete Enfields across his command. He understood, with the clarity of a man who had been watching Japanese military expansion for years, that war in the Pacific was coming. He had months, not years, to prepare. The Garand could put 8 rounds downrange in the time it took a bolt-action soldier to chamber 3. Against a Japanese army that was battle-hardened, numerically strong, and advancing with the confidence of victory, that difference was not tactical, it was existential. Washington heard the request. And then, as so often happens in the machinery of large bureaucracies preparing for wars they do not quite believe are imminent, almost nothing happened in time. The bombs fell on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The Japanese attacked the Philippines the following morning. Within days, the plan MacArthur had constructed for defending all of Luzon was collapsing. Japanese forces landed at Lingayen Gulf on December 22nd. They drove south with stunning speed. MacArthur, who had believed his army could hold the beaches, reversed himself in a desperate tactical pivot and ordered the withdrawal to Bataan, the narrow jungle peninsula that jutted into Manila Bay. The retreat was chaotic. In the confusion of those final days in December, enormous quantities of supplies were abandoned. Food that had been stockpiled in depots across central Luzon was left behind. Ammunition, equipment. When the gates of Bataan closed behind the retreating army in the first days of January 1942, roughly 80,000 American and Filipino troops found themselves trapped on a peninsula that had been stocked for perhaps half that number. The supply ships that MacArthur's officers had hoped to dispatch from Australia and Hawaii were turned back by the Japanese fleet. The naval blockade was complete. For the Filipino reservists inside that perimeter, the rifle situation was grimly illustrative of the broader catastrophe. Many of them were still carrying the same M1917 Enfields with which they had trained. Some units had no clips for the rifles they did have. In certain desperate cases, soldiers scrounged M1 Garand en-bloc clips ejected in battle. Those distinctive 8-round feeding devices that popped out of the rifle with a metallic ring when the last round was fired, and reloaded them by hand from Springfield stripper clips, round by round, under enemy fire. The army MacArthur had requested the Garands to equip was fighting with the weapons the Garands were supposed to have replaced. And yet, and this is the part of the story that military historians find remarkable, the Garands that were there performed beyond every expectation. The Philippine scouts who carried the new semi-automatic rifles became something the Japanese had not anticipated. Infantry who could sustain a withering volume of fire from fixed defensive positions in dense jungle. When Japanese assault columns moved against the Bataan line, they found themselves being stopped not by superior numbers. The Americans and Filipinos were consistently outnumbered, but by a wall of 30-06 fire that seemed to come from far more rifles than the intelligence estimates suggested. The Japanese were experienced soldiers who had fought in China and had formed conclusions about what infantry firepower looked like. The M1 Garand, in the hands of the Philippine scouts and American regulars, was producing a volume of aimed fire that didn't match any model they had encountered. MacArthur sent dispatches from his headquarters on Corregidor that his force's M1 rifles were performing in an outstanding manner, operating without mechanical failures under combat conditions as much as 7 days consecutively without cleaning or lubrication. Imagine that. A rifle cycling thousands of rounds in tropical heat, in foxhole dirt, in monsoon rain, without a malfunction. The engineers at Springfield Armory had solved, in their quiet way, one of the hardest problems in weapons design: how to make a semi-automatic rifle simple enough that a soldier in combat, exhausted, hungry, frightened, under fire, could keep it running. On February 23, 1942, newspapers across the United States ran an extraordinary pair of stories. The Washington Post headline read, "Bataan proves Garand worth." The New York Times carried, "Garand rifle praised by Gen MacArthur." Time magazine published its own account of the Garand in action, praising the weapon's performance in the most desperate fighting American soldiers had faced since the Argonne Forest in 1918. The man who had helped push the rifle through adoption, who had demanded it fire the 30-06, who had requested 84,500 of them for the Philippines, was publicly confirming from behind enemy lines on a besieged peninsula that the rifle was everything its designers had hoped it would be. None of it changed the outcome. The supplies did not come. The relief force did not come. MacArthur was ordered by Roosevelt to evacuate on the night of March 11, 1942, an order he obeyed with visible anguish, departing by PT boat to Mindanao and then to Australia, leaving behind General Jonathan Wainwright to command the defense he could no longer lead. From Australia, MacArthur went on the radio and spoke 4 words that would become one of the most famous promises of the entire war: "I shall return." The men he left behind fought on, starved, malarial, reduced to eating mules and horses and whatever the jungle could provide, their ranks decimated by disease as much as by enemy fire, The defenders of Bataan held their lines for 3 months against a Japanese army that expected to conquer the peninsula in weeks. On April 9, 1942, General Edward King ordered the surrender of the Bataan force, the largest single surrender of American military forces since the Civil War. More than 75,000 American and Filipino soldiers laid down their arms. What followed was the Bataan Death March, 60 miles on foot in tropical heat, without adequate water or food, under the supervision of Japanese guards, whose treatment of prisoners became a war crime prosecuted at Nuremberg's Pacific equivalent. Thousands died on the road. Thousands more died in the prison camps that followed. Nearly 23,000 Americans and more than 100,000 Filipinos were killed or captured in the Philippines campaign. MacArthur spent the next 2.5 years fighting his way back across the Pacific, island by island, this mile by bloody mile, toward the promise he had made from that Australian radio station. On October 20th, 1944, he waded ashore at Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, in a scene staged for the cameras with the deliberate theatrical sense he had cultivated his entire life. The men of the U.S. Sixth Army who waded ashore behind him carried M1 Garand rifles, the weapon John Garand had spent 15 years designing. The weapon MacArthur had argued should fire the 30-06. The weapon MacArthur had tried to put in 84,500 Filipino hands before the shooting started. In the end, it came back to the Philippines in the hands of the army that came to reclaim them. History has not been uniformly kind to Douglas MacArthur. There are legitimate debates about his decisions in the Philippines, about whether his initial defense plan was realistic, about the welfare of his troops during the retreat, about the circumstances of his evacuation. Those debates belong to another episode, and they deserve the careful treatment they require. But on the question of the rifle, the record is clear. MacArthur understood the M1 Garand before most of the men he commanded had ever seen one. He understood it as an administrator when he directed that it fire the 30-06 and gave it the logistical foundation it needed to function in a world war. He understood it as a commander when he looked at his undersupplied Philippine army and signed the order for 84,500 of them. He understood it as a soldier when he transmitted his battlefield reports from besieged Bataan, praising its reliability under the worst conditions infantry had faced in a generation. The rifles didn't all arrive. The war came too fast, the logistics were too broken, the Japanese Navy too dominant in the waters around the islands. But the story of MacArthur's requisition is not really a story about failure. It is a story about a general who looked at the coming war with clear eyes, who understood that the difference between a bolt-action rifle and a semi-automatic one was measured not in yards on a proving ground, but in lives on a jungle peninsula, and who did everything within his authority to give his soldiers the edge they needed. John Garand, the quiet Canadian machinist who spent 15 years in a Massachusetts armory turning an idea into a revolution, never received royalties for his invention. He transferred all rights to the U.S. government in January 1936. More than 6.5 million M1 Garands were produced during and after the war. Every one of them bore his name. He retired from Springfield Armory in 1953, lived quietly in Springfield, Massachusetts, and died in 1974 at the age of 86. George Patton called the M1 Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised. The men who fired it on Bataan, outnumbered, blockaded, half-starved, holding back a professional army with a rifle and a foxhole and whatever ammunition they had left, might have used stronger language. They deserved better odds. They had the right rifle. Sometimes that has to be enough. If this story moved you, if you believe these men and this history deserve to be remembered, subscribe to this channel, leave a comment, and share this video. Every view is a vote to keep these stories alive. And until next time, never forget the ones who held the line.